Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Cabot Annual Lecture for 2021. As you will see, this is a lecture that's going to focus on the upcoming COP26 and is particularly trying to make sure that we're asking you, are you fully paying attention to what is going on around climate change and what is the nature of the future of the planet? For those of you who don't know, the Cabot Institute is an institute that includes about 600 academics from right across the University of Bristol, all of whom focus on interdisciplinary environmental research. And if you'd like to find out more about the kind of work that we do, please do go to our website via the University of Bristol website, and you'll find details of the types of projects and the types of experts that you can access through the Cabot Institute. I'm really pleased today that we have such an exciting lecture. We have three great speakers who are going to make brief interventions, brief talks this evening, followed by a panel discussion at the end. So those speakers, first of all, are Leo Hickman, who is the director and the editor of the Carbon Brief. So Leo was a journalist, editor and author at The Guardian. And before that, he was also the WWF UK's chief advisor on climate change. He has an honorary doctorate from the University of Exeter. And in 2020, he was named Editor of the Year by the Association of British Science Writers. Our second speaker is Alyssa Gilbert, who's the Director of Policy and Translation at the Grantham Institute for Climate Change and the Environment. So Alyssa works to connect relevant research across University College London with policymakers and businesses. And specifically in the lead up to COP26, Alyssa is chairing the COP26 Universities Network, which is a UK-wide network of academics and professionals who are working to deliver impact on climate change. And our third speaker is Mya-Rose Craig, who is from Chew Valley, very close to Bristol, so local. So Mya-Rose is a conservationist, environmentalist, and a race activist who has been writing the Birdgirl blog since she was 11 years old, which now has over 5 million views. Mya-Rose particularly fights for equal access to nature for minority ethnic people. And she's the founder and president of Black2Nature. Her book, We Have a Dream, highlights 30 young environmentalists of colour from around the world who are doing amazing work, but perhaps do not get the recognition that they fully deserve. And using her roots through her authorship of the book and her blogs to amplify their voices and make sure that their voices are being heard. Finally, today, we have Professor Paul Bates from the University of Bristol, who is also the Associate Director at the Cabot Institute. So Paul is a hydrologist by background. He is a fellow of the American Geophysical Union. He is a Royal Society Wolfson Research Merit Award holder. He was awarded the CBE, and most recently he became a fellow of the Royal Society in 2021. Which, believe me, for anybody who is not a medic, is no mean achievement. Paul will be facilitating the lectures today and will be chairing the panel later on. So the way today's session will work is we'll ask each of the speakers in turn to give about a 15-minute presentation. That will be followed for each of them with a couple of questions posed by Paul. Once we've gone all through all three questions, we will then have the panel in which all three speakers will be present and will be chaired by Paul. And the questions which are going to be posed are the questions which we have collected as people registered. There was a very large number of questions, and so we're going to use that as the basis for the discussion in the panel. Finally, I'd just like to say we have great turnout for this meeting, and we all at Cabot really appreciate that. We had over 1,000 people register for the event, and I can already see that we have very large numbers of those people appearing. I should say that putting on an event of this nature requires a huge amount of work, and I'd like to extend my thanks to the Cabot team, to Amanda to Vicky Jones, to Angus Morris, to Amanda Woodman-Hardy, and to Adele Green, and all the team at Cabot who have made this event possible. So with that, thank you very much for listening to me. I'm now going to actually hand you over to the real meat of the event, and I would ask Leo if you could turn on your camera and if you could make the first presentation, please.
Well, thank you very much, Guy, and thank you for that introduction. And obviously it's a huge pleasure and total honour to be here tonight for the Cabot Institute lecture for this year. And kind of as you explained in my quick kind of bio, I'm a kind of journalist and I specialise in climate change. So the upcoming COP in a week or so is typically, it's kind of in a way a highlight of the year for me as a journalist, because I'm like a sort of pig in mud really when it comes to the COP. I've been to a few COPs now. I think I can't remember, 7 or 8 at least in a row recently. In fact, I'm dressed up for the occasion. I've even found my COP badges from the last one in Madrid, which I'm just going to show you quickly because I need to make a point. Is that if you see on these badges, they've got slightly different colours, and it's just to give you a little insight into the way that the COP split up. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what exactly is a COP and what you can expect from a COP. But due to a technical glitch, I was actually handed 2 badges the last time in COP, which is tremendously useful because I had my normal press badge, which gets me into certain areas of a COP. But with this other badge, which I shouldn't really have had, a technical staff badge, it allowed me into any of the rooms in the COP, including all of the government negotiating rooms. Now, as a journalist, that's absolute kind of manna from heaven. But what it does indicate is the COP is actually quite a sort of divided space in some ways when you're there. It's a huge conference centre divided up into media zones, government delegation zones, areas for NGOs, areas for exhibitions. And everyone is there in a way for slightly different reasons. It's funny because during kind of COVID lockdowns of the last year or so, and why we didn't have a COP, this COP we're about to have, and we didn't have it a year ago in Glasgow. You know, like many of us, I've been watching kind of box sets and Netflix, and kind of COPs to me are a bit like a sort of hybrid between Squid Game and kind of the Queen's Gambit. You've got a kind of rather brutal geopolitics going on, which I as a journalist need to kind of try to report on and explain to our kind of readership. And meanwhile, you've got this very, very complex set of negotiations, which are often described as 4D chess. And the kind of the mantra at COPs is nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And I think what we're going to see a lot of that in a week's time at Glasgow, and we're already seeing some of that brinkmanship, games playing going on with the dance at the moment that's going on between the global leaders about who is going to show up, who isn't going to show up. And it's kind of fascinating, frustrating, and that will all play out for 2 weeks at the COP. And kind of my role as a journalist, other than to sort of explain what's going on, is that you've got also 2 weeks, particularly if you say I'm not a broadcast journalist, but if you're a broadcast journalist, you've got almost 2 weeks of airtime to fill. So as a journalist, you're constantly on the hunt for stories, interesting characters, interesting stories, interesting fights, dynamics, you know, and the COPs provide all of that. And in the way that I explained that you get, you know, as I said, these kind of two types of badges, and you get different people there for different reasons. You get what people describe as inside and outside the event. So you'll hear about something called the blue zone, and you'll hear about something called the green zone at a basic level. The blue zone is the technical area that the UN is in charge of. That's where the negotiations are going. That's where you need accreditation and a badge to get in. There's actually another area that's going to be set up, or has already been set up in Glasgow, called the Green Zone, which arguably is more interesting, more colourful, which is where you'll tend to see a lot of the public events going on. And I suspect, I'm not sure, but the rumor is that that's where a lot of the climate campaigners and protesters who want to make their views known will probably get as close to being inside the COP as possible. There are protests that take place inside the blue zone, but they have to be UN accredited, and there's a special little, it kind of sounds farcical, but there's a little area drawn on the ground where the protests are allowed to take place, which is somewhat counter to the idea of protesting. But so you're at the COP, you're going to see official protests done every day at certain times, but then you're going to have a lot of the media flocking to what I suspect will be happening outside of the COP, where there is a lot of talk, and we're already hearing of policing, etc., going on. That's going to be a big media story, and will, I think, directly feed into the tensions and the dynamics of the negotiations. The other thing that we have to do as journalists, I guess, at the COPs is explain the sort of awful jargon and acronyms. It's like a kind of blizzard of acronyms. From AOSIS to CBDR to Article 6, all these very strange and alien terms, but actually have very, very real life implications in terms of action on climate change, what the impacts on climate change will be. And we as journalists have to try and relay that technical language into what I guess I would call kind of human speak, relatable words and stories that everyone can understand. And I'm just trying to think of a good example. So 6 years ago at Paris, at the famous Paris COP, COP21, where the Paris Agreement was agreed, there was an extraordinary bit of drama on the final night, actually the final afternoon, where a few things happened, where the rumor was a deal had been struck. No one, including the journalists, really knew what actually was in the detail of the agreement. But the rumor was that the French host the presidency of the COP, as the UK will be this time, and they have a unique role to sort of lead and corral all the negotiations. There was a talk that right at the last minute, Nicaragua were going to object. Now, the important to remember about the UN process at these COPs is that it's a consensus process, so everyone has to agree. So what if one country puts their flag up, then the whole thing comes crashing down. And there was a rumor right at the end that Nicaragua didn't like some bit of the wording, and the rumor is that President Obama at the time got on the phone at the White House and effectively rang the president of Nicaragua and told them to sort of stand down. And within 5 minutes, the whole thing was back up and running again. And then there was another last minute drama where there was an argument over whether the word should or shall should be used. And obviously shall has great legal implication, and that was deemed to be unacceptable by the United States because it would carry a certain amount of legal weight and therefore would have to be passed by Congress, which was a big no-no at that time. But in terms of some of the wider COP process, that's kind of describing what goes on in the actual official delegations. But as I said, there's many observers at the COPs as well, and we've heard that there's going to be about 25,000 people in Glasgow, 3,000 of which will be media, and the rest will be split between what they call observers, which are effectively the NGOs, academics, trade association, business groups, and then the actual delegations themselves. And some of the delegations can be enormous, like in Copenhagen in 2009, the Brazilian delegation was almost 900 people. There's a rumor today that Vladimir Putin has said that he won't be coming to COP in Glasgow, but he's still sending a delegation of 300 officials, which is kind of extraordinary, and feeds into the very, very valid question around why do we even have COPs? Why can't they just be doing what we're doing right now and have them on Zoom or Microsoft Teams or whatever? And it's a very, very good question, but I don't think it would work personally. I've seen the way the human interactions happen in these negotiations, and I just don't think the virtual experience can deliver that. And I think an important reason why that can't happen, and was demonstrated actually 6 months ago when the so-called intersessional talks were held, the lead-up talks were held, which were traditionally held in Bonn in Germany, but were held for 3 weeks online. And I think the perception was broadly that it was a bit of a failure because the dynamic didn't work. And crucially, it meant a lot of voices that should have been in the process were either cut off, were downplayed, and it just wasn't a representative dynamic. And I think that is challenging, because if I as a journalist want to go and get the voice of the Philippines or Peru or an indigenous group in Amazonia or whatever it may be, I can access and find all that as a journalist in the COP very easily when you're there in person. But online, that is incredibly challenging. So I think that's going to be one of the big question marks that still hangs over this process. Definitely why we have a COP during this era of COVID and lockdowns and Zoom calls, etc. I think that debate will continue, and I suspect in future years that we will move much more to a sort of hybrid process of COP. So some of it is online, and there's no doubt that some of it can be held online, but the negotiations, I think, will always need to be in person to a large degree, and therefore the media will always want to be there because they cannot report on that process if they're some way shielded from that process. But I'm very aware of time, so I'm probably gonna hand back to I think it's Paul, isn't it now, to sort of lead into the next speaker, and then I'm really looking forward to the wider discussion as well after we've heard from the next speakers.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Leo. And as Guy said, my name is Paul Bates, and I'm going to be hosting the questions this evening. So, Leo, that was a fantastic insight to what goes on at COP. And I personally have never been to one. So to get that colour and behind the scenes flavour, I think is incredibly useful. And hopefully it'll allow us all, as we're watching this from afar, to understand a bit more of what's going on behind the scenes. So thank you so much for that. You raised an interesting point about the US Congress and the wording of treaties. And it's clear from that, you know, national governments do get the opportunity to veto some of the decisions that are made at COP, and the biggest emitters are clearly critical to get through the process. So what do you think about Biden's chances of getting whatever he signs up to through the US Congress, and what happens if he's not able to do that?
Well, we know from the history of the COP stretching back to the early 90s that it's almost been a process, and the Paris Agreement was certainly designed as a process to be almost US Congress proof. So if you remember when Donald Trump came in, and actually that was a very, very memorable moment when it was at the Marrakesh COP in 2016 when he was elected. I mean, I remember being there and seeing all of the ashen faces of all of the delegates, including many scientists from America, just totally stunned that Donald Trump had been elected. But it did raise an interesting question, because I think Barack Obama quite cleverly had almost designed the Paris Agreement to be Donald Trump proof to some degree, and the fact that it had been designed to have this kind of 4-year mechanism where someone has to signal they want to leave and then they have to pull out. So for 30 odd years, really, this whole system has recognized that climate policy will not be signed off by US Congress. You know, we've seen that from the Kyoto Protocol all the way through to the Paris Agreement. So it has to be done really by executive order of the US president of the day. So even if Biden has set himself this October 31st deadline to get his infrastructure bill through Congress, which is looking pretty dicey at the moment, in fact, you know, very dicey. So Joe Biden in a week's time is going to arrive in Glasgow with all his cabinet members, all his entourage, and he will not be waving his magic piece of paper saying, I've got it through Congress. So that is already slightly undermining, to say the least, this whole dynamic. But I think there's also there's what can be done through legislation through Congress, which is limited, but there's also what can be done state by state in the US, what can be done through business action, through communities, etc. So it's not a be all and end all, but it does send a certain signal, again, that the US political process at the federal level just can't really deal with climate change.
Interesting views. So, I mean, we have COP as a major part of global climate policy and negotiations, but we have another big entity that has a strong bearing on climate policy, and that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, who produce their assessment reports. So what's your view of how IPCC and the COP process interact, and is that effective at the moment?
I think the IPCC and the relationship between what we call the UNFCCC, the UN framework on climate change, and the IPCC is actually a really interesting and fascinating relationship, and is made more so by the Paris Agreement, because in Paris, it was actually the part of the Paris Agreement was a formal request by the parties involved, all the 197 nations that signed up to it. They actually formally requested the IPCC and their scientists to produce a report saying what the impacts of 1.5 degrees of global warming would be around the planet. And actually that was interesting, because it was, at the time, there weren't many scientific papers explicitly looking at that question. So it led to a great big sort of avalanche of papers over the next 2 or 3 years, which were then synthesized, summarized, and brought into this kind of rather extraordinary report that was published in late 2018 that actually had a profound impact, I think. When we go back in history and look back at the impact of that, I've been reporting on climate change for 15, 20 years, and I don't think I remember a report as having as much as a dramatic impact as that. And it led, I think, directly to the within a few months, the kind of, and influenced greatly the kind of school strikes movement, Greta Thunberg, the XR protests that happened in April 2019 in London, then quickly spread. And those in turn had an impact on, certainly on domestic policy here in the UK. And I think there's now this interesting question around the IPCC, around whether it is informed by the UN process, and whether it's informing the UN process, and kind of we're now about to enter this cycle, which is what the Paris Agreement was designed to do, is be this, what they call a 5-year ratchet mechanism. The idea that all the countries come together over 5 years, put a pledge on the table, it's all assessed in what they call a global stocktake, and then they go again 5 years later, the idea being you ratchet up your ambition. And that's where we're at now, the second phase of that, which is why this COP is the most important since Paris, because it's the first moment of that ratchet. Now, there's pressure by some parties to make the IPCC be involved in that global stocktake, which is to some degree politicizing the IPCC. And I think there's a really interesting question for the IPCC as it comes out of its 6th assessment report cycle next year. What happens next? Does it just roll straight into the 7th, or does it sort of slightly adapt and change? It's a really interesting open question.
It's interesting as well, because increasingly the fundamental science on climate change is incontrovertible. I mean, the basic mechanisms of CO2 increases leading to atmospheric warming, and then the knock-on impacts are so well understood. There's almost no sensible dissent from that position now, and that's a difference from a few years ago. The IPCC reports are now unequivocal over the mechanism. There's still details about climate change we don't yet know, but fundamentally,
well, for my money, what they call the Working Group 1 report, which looks at the physical science basis, to me, that's, as you say, there's some details around there, but that's done and dusted, really. It's Working Group 3, which to me, as a journalist, is by far the most interesting. That's what we do about energy. That's the cost of it, that, et cetera, et cetera. And Working Group 2 is about the impacts, which equally has huge, areas of interest around relating to climate justice and fair and equity, and things, and kind of real life impacts. But it's those 2 areas of the climate change investigation from scientists, both physical science and social sciences. That's where that for me as a journalist, that's the most interesting area now.
Yeah, I would completely agree. And seeing as my work is on the impact of climate change on floods, I've got a vested interest. So thank you. The check's in the post. Thank you very much. That's brilliant. Leo, thank you very much for your insights. We'll hear from you again at the panel discussion at the end, but we're now going to hear from Alyssa Gilbert from Imperial College. So Alyssa, I'd invite you to come online, and over to you for your presentation. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much, Paul. Just give me a moment while I share my presentation. So I'm afraid I'm going to use some slides. I hope that doesn't disturb anyone's sense of calm. It's always nice to listen to someone speak fluently and engagingly, but I've got some slides so I don't forget what I was going to say. So thank you for having me. I'm going to follow on from Leo's great introduction to what a COP is like to talk a little bit about the UK's role as president of these upcoming climate negotiations. I recognize it seems like the audience for this talk is really quite international, but to just give you a feeling, if you were based in the UK right now, like I am and Leo is, there's really a huge amount of discussion about climate change in a whole load of different organizations and also in the popular press. And that really demonstrates that when your government takes charge of diplomatic leadership on something like a large international climate change conference, it starts to really influence all of the other organizations that are in really every part of life, from local governments through to private sector, big and small, schools, and a number of other organizations, anyone you can think of. So I wanted to reflect a little bit on the UK's presidency of COP. So just to step back, why is COP important and COP26 important? Because sometimes when I speak to people about climate change, they ask, really, does it matter, this kind of very international scale of activity? So just to kind of reiterate that these international discussions on climate change are really essential because climate change is a global issue. And to tackle a global issue, you need international collaboration. Wherever greenhouse gas emissions are emitted, wherever that happens around the world, that's going to affect our climate. And therefore, we all need to take action together. So international collaboration is essential. And these discussions that are held annually about climate change and what kind of targets people are signing up to and what action will be taken needs to be done all together in some way. And so these are important discussions. It also is a way of showing that governments have a real responsibility to deliver part of action on climate change. And so what you hear, these statements that will be made by national governments, some have been making them in the run-up to the negotiations, and some will probably make them during the negotiations, especially the first few days, which are set aside for world leader statements. Those are a statement of government's responsibility. But equally, governments are, one of the partners. Hand in hand, I've put here with businesses and people, so the private sector, individual citizens, or groups of civil society. But you'll often hear some of those different parties saying, well, I'm going to wait until the government does something to do something, says a business, or government says, well, I'm not really ready to do it until I hear that business is really ready to do this. And both of those might say, well, if customers or my voters, the citizens, aren't interested, I'm also not interested. But the truth is, for us to tackle this climate change problem, we need all three. And the Climate Change Conference is an important gathering, not only of international governments, but all of those other organizations around that Leo referred to that then come together to make commitments and demonstrate the action that they're taking. So it provides important momentum. And the presidency is provided not just by the UK this year, but has been provided in partnership with Italy. So I guess the question I wanted to address was, why now? Why is the UK taking on the presidency now? So it's been 26 COPs and 27 years since the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed, and since the Conference of the Parties, this COP, so the meetings of the people who signed up to that convention, have started meeting. And every year there's a different presidency, and that's the government that guides the diplomatic effort, leads the discussions, and delivers some kind of agreement on what next steps. So why is the UK taking this on now, when actually there's been a lot of activity on climate change? A lot of researchers. I work in a university, but also a lot of other work on policy development and so on happening in the UK for pretty much all of those years. So there's a real opportunity in the UK right now to define its new role in the world after leaving the European Union, and the UK wants to kind of show that it has a place in the world of diplomacy and a place of its own. It's also a chance to try out new diplomatic relationships and approaches. Again, the UK acting in a way on its own, but also it's been trying to develop relationships through trade agreements, etc., with other countries, and with old allies through the Commonwealth, but also new allies. And so that's quite important. It's an opportunity for this move towards action. So there's been the focus at COP will be on agreements and targets and how to measure those, but also it's time to do something about all of these things. And so it's a bit of a pivot point. And so that's a time that UK might want to get involved. There's also the challenge right now of including all actors. So there's a very structured approach, just like Leo defined that very structured approach to protest. There's actually a very structured approach to the inclusion of different actors in those discussions at COP. Only particular ways that you can get involved in those discussions if you are, for example, from a business group or from a youth representative group. So including all actors, either directly in the negotiations or in the actions that follow, is an opportunity. And of course, I think the UK sees, as you also see from other countries, an opportunity now to shape the global markets that might come out of the drives to a more rapid progression to a low carbon or zero carbon and resilient world. So what is it that the UK can actually bring to the discussion? So I think there's a hope that we can export things. The government quite keen on selling things to other countries or being the first mover, and that could be things like technology. There's a drive for the UK to perhaps, excuse the pun, deliver perhaps new electric vehicle technology, perhaps nuclear technology, and many others. A lot of logistics and data software related technology as well that can help deliver on zero carbon, but also exporting laws and ideas. We have quite a large kind of, relatively speaking, consultancy sector that does a lot of work on this. And we were the first country to have a climate change act that was put in place in 2008 and now has been exported and improved upon all around the world. And so this is an opportunity for the UK to share all different kinds of experiences and somewhat sell them, to share, hopefully, our ability to bring people together successfully, especially at this difficult time, let's see. But also to mobilize the diplomatic networks, so the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and networks such as the Science Innovation Network, which is a network that the UK runs around the world through its embassies. It's an opportunity to try and mobilize that to achieve a diplomatic goal. In terms of the timing, as well as this being, the 26th or 27th year of COPs, because last year there was skipped it because of COVID pandemic. The timing, it was quite convenient because the UK hosted the G7 and Italy hosted the G20, and that provided this nice alignment. And you saw at the G7 quite a lot of announcements led by the UK on climate. So trying to pull together these different spheres of geopolitical leadership in parallel to each other was a real opportunity for the UK. In terms of timing, though, the COVID pandemic has brought about some challenges. So there was a reflection in the earlier discussion about the extent to which you can and cannot deliver this kind of negotiation and collaboration activity in a virtual setting, and that's been tested. And it's important to test that anyway for an issue like climate change, but also important to kind of recognize where the face-to-face part is essential. But equally, there's this economic challenge that comes along with the timing of COVID. There's an opportunity now to use recovery packages and economic investments that countries are now making to push for green recovery approaches. And we see very significant amounts of money being spent around the world right now that could not have been foreseen several COPs ago, that there would be such a large amount of public financial investment in a range of countries. But unfortunately, many of these are just business as usual, building things back as they were before. And in terms of timing, let's hope the UK is planning to set an example. Just yesterday, the government published reams and reams, I think probably 600 to 700, 800 pages of policy documents related to climate change, including the UK's net zero strategy, information on how to reduce the impacts of action on climate change on the most vulnerable people. That's a Treasury report on how to distribute the costs of net zero and the benefits, as well as reports on innovation related to climate change, and all released, not surprisingly, in time for COP. And that's the UK government's approach to show that there is perhaps setting an example here. And it's also a chance really to secure support for this climate change action at home. So this motivation, as I said, there's really a lot of conversation in the UK right now about climate change, and the desire for us to deliver successful diplomacy. And therefore, that it's easier to gain support for some of the activities taking it home. hopefully the UK government sees some innovation opportunities, as well as the chance to demonstrate that we are all kind of in this challenge together. And I think the UK probably saw this as an opportunity to secure other priorities that they may have as well, again, reflecting some of those geopolitical priorities for the UK at the moment. What have we seen so far? Well, just a little bit of insight into what's been going on. When the UK took on the presidency, it was pre-COVID. The intention was it to be actually last year. The president was announced to be Claire Perry, who was someone who was very actively engaged in climate change, very interested in it. She openly spoke about her geography background and caring about this agenda very much. She was moved aside and replaced by Alex Sharma. So there was a lot of concern in the middle of that about how strongly he would take on this particular remit. It's something that he hadn't really spoken about before. Of course, there was the COVID challenge, which not only delayed the event, but continues to actually pose a challenge to the timing of all of the planning. Everything feels a little bit last minute. It's uncertain still about who will be there, partly for these health reasons, and it's also quite uncertain about how to manage an event and both of the blue zone, so the closed zone, as well as the very public areas, how to make this really accessible to people and engaging in this context. We've also seen some statements from government. So as I mentioned, hundreds of pages of action published yesterday, but a year before that, we saw the government publish its 10-point plan on the environment, which, to me felt a bit like Apache, picking up of some of the key things that were already government priorities across different sectors, but could add up to 10 green things, and something a little bit more comprehensive yesterday, although maybe perhaps not totally comprehensive. But we have seen the government feeling obliged because of this limelight to make very clear statements about what they're doing about greenhouse gas removal. And I've deliberately chosen some pictures here of innovation and technology, high-tech solutions, because that is the line that the government has been taking very much. These pictures are all available to use in the run-up to COP on the Climate Visuals Countdown website. We've seen quite a lot of high-profile contributions from the Prime Minister himself talking about this issue on many occasions, but also Alex Sharma and other ministers talking about this issue. Again, that's really great from a UK delivering action at home perspective too, and also bringing in the constituents who may have elected those officials. Some of the things we've also seen behind the scenes, very early on, the UK government sort of thought about how they should take that diplomatic leadership, and they came up with some campaigns, campaign topics that they wanted to prioritize. Those campaign topics have changed quite a bit over time, and I don't know what was happening behind the scenes. It is a cause for concern if not having that consistency. And those campaigns at the beginning seemed to be very focused on things that were important in the UK context, reflected things that the UK did well, such as moving away from coal, something that UK can easily say we've done successfully already, but perhaps more of a challenge elsewhere, rather than being something more comprehensive and something very linked to the core goals of COP itself, which are mitigation targets, adaptation, climate finance, and we see the government having changed its campaigns to align more closely and fall within those main topics for COP now. Some contradictions. We've seen the government make decisions outside the immediate climate change space that seemed very contradictory to some of the messages we want around climate change. One of the ones that was most concerning was scrapping the Department for International Development and changing the UK's plans to stay at donating a certain amount of their money to foreign aid, to go below the previously promised percentage for that. And although they've upheld their commitment to climate finance internationally, that was a big concern, because that money is then perhaps coming from other worthy causes. So we saw some contradictions along the way, which is obviously cause for concern. But we do see goodwill and rising interest on climate change action in the UK. And what was happening behind the scenes, I think one of the things that was really notable to me was that there was this big rush at the beginning when the UK was taking on the presidency to hire 150 new people into the cabinet office to try and deliver this. Really a mix of people who were expert in this field and people who really had never done work on this before. But there's been a chance with that extra year for that to settle down, and those people with really deep expertise that have worked on this issue for a long time, bringing that into the rest of the team, which has been really exciting to see. I'm conscious of time, Paul, so I'm not going to go through all of the focus issues, but as I said, there were some campaigns at the beginning, science campaigns and campaigns on certain areas of focus that have switched, and the really great potential now is to move towards action and widening participation, widening these partnerships and the discussions towards action. We can build on the successes of the UK so far, and you see that repeated in the net zero strategy yesterday, that we have the Committee on Climate Change with a really strong analytical approach that's the basis of UK action and really something to be proud of. And we've also done quite a bit of decarbonisation, at least domestically so far, while growing our economy. But diplomacy is a really important part of this story. And what I'm waiting to see is whether all of these behind the scenes things that should have been taking place in different countries and with different constituencies has been happening as one would hope, and will deliver some kind of agreement when we get to Glasgow. And yeah, there's a sort of some presidency themes, if you want to look them up, that will be playing out over the time at COP. Let's hope that the UK, the package, and I haven't read all 700 pages, show that we're walking the talk. I'm holding my breath to see what will happen. And most important to me, actually, is that we've got things that follow on and we don't peak. Everyone gets interested in this big discussion that's going to happen in Glasgow. And regardless of what happens there, it's really important that we all follow up on the action that we know we need to take. So I'll leave it there.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Alyssa. That was a great insight to government and diplomatic approach taken behind the scenes and what's been going on in the Cabinet Office in the run-up to the British presidency at COP. A lot of your talk, you touched on the idea of action and the tension between technological solutions and actually personal behavioural change. And we had a lot of questions from our audience on those themes. And I wondered if, based on your knowledge of climate change policy, what for our audience would be the three things that they could personally change to make a difference from climate change? What would you advise as being the effective things that people could do?
Yeah. So it's a great question. And I know it's something that really matters a lot to people. So we actually put together 9 things you can do about climate change. So if anyone wants to go onto the Imperial College site, they can find 9 things that they can do about climate change. But to pick out a few of those, first of all, again, noting this is quite an international audience, the things that you can do really depend on who you are and where you live and what you're doing already, of course. Some of the things that we point people to is, first of all, actually things to reduce your emissions directly. So really think about how you travel. Your source of how you travel can be a really big source of emissions, particularly if you fly. That's a really big impact on the environment. So try and replace or reduce your flights wherever possible with more cleaner ways of traveling, particularly train. In some ways you can avoid travel too, which is something we've all been doing at the serious end recently, but also think about how you travel more locally. So a lot of people drive distances that they could cycle or walk or take public transport. So using those other forms of transport can be quite powerful. The other thing that is actually really important is the where you live. So if you live in a house that you own, or you can have some influence over the person who rents it to you, think about the fabric and the shape of the place that you live in. That can be interesting both from reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but the building fabric and where you live is also really important in terms of the electricity you use and how you can be ready for the impacts of climate change. So the world is getting warmer, floods are more frequent. So think about whether there's green space around your house that can help with cooling in cities. It can help absorb rainwater, and that has an impact not just on you, but the people who live nearby you. So that also is something that it's harder to do if you're not an owner-occupier, but where you live can make a difference. But the other thing that I would say that is really important is to make your voice heard. And so, there's this interplay, as I said, between decisions that can be made by governments, businesses, and by an action that we can take by citizens. Your voice really matters, as I said, as a voter to the governments, as a consumer. All added up, that can make a difference to what businesses are willing to do. And they will only do these things if they hear your voice. So make your voice heard, but also make your voice heard to your friends and family. That's something that I think people often find quite difficult. It's maybe easier to write an angry letter to your local councillor or your MP than it is to sit with someone who really disagrees with you about this issue, but you might have a strong emotional connection to, right? They might be your parents or an uncle or your children or somebody who doesn't really understand why this issue is so important to you. You are the person that those people will trust most. Have those conversations, because that can also spread action further.
That's fantastic. Great advice. So think about travel, think about your homes, but think about your ability to influence others around you. So that's great. And that kind of leads me on to my second question for you, which is about communicating both the science of climate change and the requirements and needs for behavioural and policy change around that. So are there insights from academic research, perhaps in the social sciences, that inform how we should be approaching climate communication? I'd be quite interested to hear your take on that.
Yeah, so there really is a lot of work looking at how we should be talking to people about climate change. And I think the important thing is that there's a lot that we need to do differently. And even if we take a very technology-driven approach to tackling climate change, technology on its own, just sort of sitting in a box, in a glossy box or museum, doesn't deliver anything. Yeah. People need to be interested in owning the technology, or being, some people need to be the first mover. Some people need to be the last person to buy it as well. Some people need to just be the people who are interested in getting the skills and starting up a new business. And the way in which we talk about different technologies, different solutions, even the challenge of climate change itself can influence people's willingness to try something new. And so a combination of using social sciences to understand audiences and how different language affects people is actually really, really important. And also there have been some sort of direct ways to empower and engage and listen to people, understand their perceptions. That's also really, really important. So for example, very recently, the UK held a climate assembly. And actually the concepts of climate assembly came from social scientists who looked at how to have engaged, proper democracy, different approaches to doing that, and how that might affect people's willingness to then engage in the solutions. So that kind of social science to practice is important in the communication, in approaches to democracy, and empowering people genuinely listening and rolling out successful solutions.
Yeah, and I guess as well to recognise that there's not just one general public. There are many publics out there and different groups want information conveyed to them in different ways.
Yeah, exactly, and kind of segmenting that and understanding different people and how they like to be engaged with, as well as what their issues and their concerns are. Yeah, it can really vary quite significantly.
Fantastic. Alyssa, thank you very much. We'll hear from you again in a little bit at the panel discussion, but we'll move on now and hear from Mya-Rose Craig. So Mya, I'd like to invite you to come forward and talk to the audience. So over to you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so I guess in terms of what I'm doing here, I mainly want to add the youth perspective to, I suppose, the climate change movement in general, but especially with COP26 coming up. And in terms of me, I think I still technically count as a youth. I'm 19, and I've been very involved in the climate change movement for quite a few years now, particularly in terms of fighting racism and fighting against discrimination within environmental spaces. But I think the thing I wanted to start with is the cliche, but I think it's so important to remind people of what we're really dealing with, the severity of the issue that we're dealing with. So I'm currently 19. In 2030, I will only be 28 years old. In 2050, I will only be 48 years old. So all of these goals that we're talking about in terms of climate change are very soon within my lifetime. I'm not going to be old at all. I'm going to be young or middle-aged. And, there are many activists younger than me who are going to be younger than that. And I suppose the thing I wanted to start with is that young people are absolutely aware that we are going to live to see the effects of climate change. We're going to live and suffer through the effects of climate change. But I think if I had to pick one word to describe the youth movement, the youth side of the wider climate change movement, it would be intersectional. I think that intersectionality has become incredibly important to young people, and it's very central in terms of the way that they think about issues, talk about issues, think about the way that we're going to tackle things going forwards. And in terms of what intersectionality actually means within this context, it's lots of things. For example, Youth Strikes for Climate has run an amazing project working with Indigenous activists from all over the world, sometimes flying them out to the West or bringing them out to the West in some shape or form, to hear them speak, to have their voices heard, which is incredibly important. We have people pointing out that the global south has already been dealing with the impacts of climate change for years, even decades in some aspects, and that we absolutely have to listen to people. And what a lot of this boils down to is taking a step back from that Western perspective and thinking about climate change on much bigger terms, both geopolitically, like we were talking about earlier in terms of COP26, but also in terms of the way that we think about these issues in general and the way that we talk about them. For example, in terms of Indigenous communities, for a lot of them, they don't regard the environmental movement or environmentalists as, I suppose, their friends for a long period of time, partially due to the history of colonization, and the way that environmentalism is often used as a tool of modern day colonization. Lots of people are very wary to get involved with the wider environmental movement and wouldn't even call themselves environmentalists, even if they are fighting for the planet and the well-being of the planet. So there are lots of different things that people are doing to push more for this intersectionality. For me personally, a lot of my activism has been shaped by the fact that I'm half Bangladeshi and I have family still living in Bangladesh, which is a country that has been terribly affected by climate change and will continue to do so going forward. But I suppose for me, I feel like the platforming of voices of people from these backgrounds is incredibly important. So last year I wrote a book called We Have a Dream that was all about promoting the voices of 30 young activists of colour from all around the world and just hearing their voices, hearing what they had to say. And there were so many different perspectives on so many different environmental issues and climate change based issues. And I suppose that's the second facet of intersectionality. It's not just for the sake of equality, even though that is important in and of itself. It improves the movement, it makes it more sustainable. It helps you gain a wider understanding of the issues that we're really trying to tackle. And I think that young people are very aware of that. I think something really interesting though, that it was a few weeks ago now that the study came out, but it was showing, it was an international survey showing the levels of climate anxiety in young people aged 16 to 25. And they came out with I suppose this concept that, to quote directly, it was profoundly affecting huge numbers of young people around the world. And over 50% of the young people studied in this survey felt that the planet was doomed, that there was nothing that could be done, that we had resigned ourselves to this fate, that we've destroyed the planet. And I think that there are so many different reasons for that. I think partially a lot of young people have no reason to have any faith in world leaders, you know, in these various climate change conferences. I think something that was a very defining moment for me was being about 13 and watching the Paris climate change conference and feeling so excited as a kid, because I thought that climate change had been solved. I thought that, or if not solved, then I thought action was going to be taken. I thought something was going to happen. And then nothing did. And so many young people have had this experience over and over again where they have been absolutely let down by their world leaders, partially because of the age difference, partially because there is a massive issue in terms of short-termism within our governments, and partially because until very recently, climate change was still seen as quite a radical niche issue, which I'll talk about in a second. But I think the other aspect of doomism that is so interesting is, I think when people think there's no hope, they don't take action. And this concept of climate doomism is actually currently being pumped out by various fossil fuel think tanks. They're trying to take away the hope from people, but young people in particular. And that is because despite everything, the younger generations have had an extremely important impact on the wider climate change conversation in a way I don't think is particularly acknowledged a lot of the time. But if we think about how the climate change conversation was within politics less than 10 years ago, say 6 years ago, it was completely different. It was seen as radical to be prioritizing climate change over other issues. It was seen as very left-wing. And I mean, the politicization of environmental issues is a completely different, if not very important conversation. But I think one of the reasons that climate change has stepped away from that and has become a core issue for people, including politicians, which hopefully we'll see at COP26, is because of young people. And it's because of the way that young people have been protesting and stepping out into the streets and showing that they care. And there was this sort of moment for, I think, a lot of world leaders where they realized that even if they didn't necessarily have to take action, they had to at least say that they were going to take action in order to engage with that young audience that politicians are always desperately trying to engage with in order to try and get their vote. And so suddenly climate change became very mainstream. And I think we cannot underestimate just how important that has been. I'm aware I'm running out of time. So I think also something I want to talk about really quickly is I think something that young people have taken a step away from completely, I suppose this links into intersectionality, is for a long time, I think there was a narrative of climate change being a great equalizer, that it was going to be this sort of post-apocalyptic thing where everyone's lives would be destroyed. And I think one of the most interesting things that the youth perspective has added to climate change is tying in further all of the various other issues that are going on. So you suddenly have lots and lots of people talking about how actually that's not true at all, because class is a massive factor in terms of climate change, and the poorest and most vulnerable people in society will suffer first, and are in fact even in Western countries already suffering, while middle class or upper class people aren't really feeling the impact of these issues yet. We have people talking about how actually, you know, the patriarchy, misogyny, means that climate change and other environmental issues are impacting women more than men. We have people talking about how racism ties into this, and all of this is incredibly important, if not making the issue more complex. And so I think it is this younger, more radical perspective that we're getting more and more of. And I think that's what a lot of this boils down to. I think young people are fantastic because they are so much better at taking a step away from, I suppose, this narrative of that's how things have always been, that's how society functions, and thinking up radical solutions, radical ideas around where we can go going forwards and what actually we need to tackle currently. And so I guess what I want to end with is just, you know, it is a bit corny, but young people are the future. And I think that they're going to play such an important role, both in COP26 and within the wider climate change movement going forwards. I think that the protests are going to be fascinating at COP26. I'm very interested to see how, I know we were talking about it earlier, but how they are actually portrayed by the media, especially with all of the Insulate Britain stuff going on at the moment. But yeah, I think we need radical change to fix what is a radical world-ending issue, and I think that this youth perspective is going to be critical in terms of that. But thank you.
Fantastic, thank you very much. So Mya-Rose, you raised an absolutely critical and fundamental point that the people most impacted by climate change are not going to be the people who are making policy, who are charged with making policies, or even the scientists. You know, for someone like me, you know, by the time of the end of my life in the mid-century, when we won't have seen the worst effects of climate change yet. Those are reserved or will still be forthcoming, but you're going to feel it, unfortunately. It's almost like we've got the wrong people in the room. But nevertheless, there's an important question here about, therefore, how can the urgency of the climate crisis be conveyed, both to the decision makers, perhaps through protest or democratic mechanisms or journalism or anything, or to young people who might have, as you say, been persuaded that nothing is possible?
Yeah, I think that's interesting, partially because obviously those are coming from two very different ends of the spectrum in terms of, I suppose, climate change communication. I will say one thing about young people in general is I don't think I've ever met anyone within my generation that doesn't believe in climate change, which is a win, I suppose. But I think in general, the climate crisis has always had a communication issue. And I think that the way that we talk about it with people has never been particularly helpful in terms of engaging people with these issues. Historically, it was always very scientific and always very apocalyptic. I'm thinking of Al Gore and things like that from the 90s, which people obviously watched the film and they were horrified. So I think we had a lot of that going on, which we are starting to take a step away from. But I think in general, the issue with climate change is how distant it feels for a lot of people, both geographically and time-wise. And the reality is that a lot of people are busy living, they're busy trying to like get food on the table, get their kids to school. They don't feel like they have the time or the effort, the mental space to think about something that might not impact them for another 5 or 10 years. Especially because, you know, we have such an individualist narrative around environmental issues that it's really off-putting for a lot of people because they don't feel like they're in a space to make lifestyle changes in that way. So I think really the easiest way to engage more people, convey the urgency of this issue, is to help people understand that how close it is. And so I suppose in the UK, the way I talk about it quite a lot is to do with flooding, because I think that's the most tangible way that we're seeing climate change at the moment. And I'm from the Southwest in particular, where we have a lot of flooding. People's houses are getting swept away. And I think very quickly within the media, it became a narrative of like, oh, it's that time of year, the floods are happening again, rather than acknowledging that this is a symptom of climate change and it's only going to get worse. I think talking to people from, say, London and saying, actually, insurance people are already upping your insurance because they know that your house is going to get flooded in a few years' time. Talking to people whose houses built on floodplains and saying, actually, you're at massive risk, making it real for people. I think more globally, it's a similar thing. So in terms of my original engagement with the climate change movement, a lot of that, like I said before, came from the fact that I had family in Bangladesh, and in secondary school, the only time Bangladesh was ever mentioned was to say, oh yeah, that's the country that's going to be underwater in 20 years' time. And, you know, I have family dealing with drought and flooding and monsoon and things like that. But I think one of the most interesting things I learned quite recently is that there's actually a lot of climate change scientists within Bangladesh, which I didn't know about before because they're not promoted on that global level. You hear over and over again from Western scientists, but I think also hearing from these different perspectives is going to be really critical, especially at things like COP, which was this sort of tangle of geopolitics and not necessarily, well, we already said, not necessarily figuring out the best way to help everyone deal with climate change.
Yeah, and I can certainly confirm Bangladesh flood scientists, climate scientists are excellent. We work with some within the Cabot Institute and do some amazing research with them. It's interesting, Bangladesh, although it faces a plethora of hazards, actually it's made great strides over the last 50 years in improving its resilience. It's still at risk and under threat, but it is in many ways a success story in the global south. So, you know, it's a country I'm very, very interested in. But in terms of conveying the urgency, there's also a need for education as well. And perhaps we could just finish by touching on the needs for climate change education. And I don't just mean school education. In many ways, I mean educating people. You know, the people who have most influence on the decision making are the ones who are most insulated from the effects of climate change. It's middle class people in the global north, sort of white males just like me. How do you convey the message, climate change education, to those groups who've been a long time out of formal education themselves?
I guess firstly, in terms of actual school education, I think looking back, the way that climate change was taught to me was very shocking. Say in 2000, this is only probably 2015, I was taught that climate change was just one of several viable possibilities of what was happening to the planet at the time, which, like I said, is looking back absolutely shocking, because we knew by that point that climate change was real. So I think, and there has been an overhaul of the education system since, so I don't know what's going on now. But I suspect in general, the way, the language that we use around climate change is always so, like I said, distant and scientific. And I think that we need to be taught in general in no uncertain terms that this is what's happening, which sounds so basic, but it just wasn't happening. I think in terms of people in general, I think historically, there's always been this thing of wanting to have balance in the media. And part of that would say maybe be having a climate change scientist and having a climate change denier on TV to sort of battle it out, not acknowledging that the climate change denier is part of a tiny percentage of scientists who have been disproved. And I suppose in general, it's, yeah, treating climate change as the single truth. I think something that is a massive issue that isn't really talked about enough is, well, I guess I have an opportunity to talk about it now, the politicization of environmental issues, which historically we didn't see in the same way. And it's part of this wider hyper politicization of everything, I suppose. But you have this thing where suddenly environmental issues are broken down into, if you're in the left, you care about environmental issues, and if you're in, right wing, then you don't care about environmental issues. And it's not acknowledging the much more complex facets of all of this. I speak to people, I suppose, especially more on the right-wing side of things, who don't understand that there are right-wing ways of approaching dealing with environmental issues that center the economy and center money. And so I think in general, this is one of the biggest barriers that we need to break down going forward in order to truly deal with environmental issues, especially because we're seeing our politicians reflect that and are very wary to make big environmental strides. I think HS2 is a really key example of that. They didn't want to step down because they didn't want it to look like the environmentalists were winning, whatever that means. And so, yeah, I think just education, language around climate change is super important, but also the way that politics treats it in general.
That's an excellent point, and a good point to bring in the rest of the panelists, to bring Leo and Alyssa back, and to talk a little bit as a group about some of the issues around COP26 and the climate debates in general. So welcome back, Alyssa and Leo. And so thinking about either COP26 or the prospects for limiting global warming to within safe levels. We had a really nice open question from a lady called Polly Hill when we asked the audience, and her question was, what's a best case scenario now? And I'll leave it up to you to interpret what scenario you want to tackle. But what do you think, either for COP or climate change more generally? What's the best that we can hope for? So who wants to go first?
I suppose coming from more of an activist perspective, I feel like I have such low expectations of our leaders, and yet over and over again I'm disappointed. And so I suppose for me, a best case scenario post COP26 would be action, would be actually seeing something happen in a broad, tangible way, making difference, which I feel like isn't a very interesting answer, but that's all I want at the moment. I want something to change.
So Alyssa, you've seen the inside of the process a little bit. What's your hope? Do you think we will get a concrete action from this COP, or how do you think it's going to pan out?
So I think in terms of COP, in a way, regardless of the detail, I think the most important thing is to show continued commitment collaboratively for all governments that this is a really, really important issue. And so not a falling apart or a tit for tat between this government and that government, a kind of continued commitment to this being an issue. A way, and a concrete way that I would feel that was really underpinned is if there was some serious signs that some of the really tricky COVID recovery stuff that countries are dealing with could be shown to be delivering on climate too. For me, that would be like really great. If there would be some countries where they have serious sort of packages that they're pouring into their economy and they say, actually, most of this is going to only go to things that are low carbon and resilience oriented. But then my other thing, I would just completely agree with what Mia said, that it's all about action now. And so for me, again, because this question was posed perhaps broader than COP, it's about sustained action that's as rapid as possible whilst being really sustainable. So there is also some evidence that if we move too rapidly towards action on climate change, you'll upset so many people or change things so rapidly that they won't continue on that path. We won't actually secure the kind of end game of a genuinely zero carbon world. So really clear actions that take us there, but basically bring people with us and make use, as you said, Paul, of all of that important social science, listening to all of the different constituents, and empowering and engaging with the people that Mia was talking about as well.
And Leo, do you think in a few weeks' time you'll be reporting on a successful COP, or will you be writing articles that say, well, we didn't quite get the pledges from countries to reduce their carbon emissions that we were hoping for?
Yeah, I think I was at Paris and I remember that sort of euphoric moment that Mya-Rose was talking about as well, which she was watching on and looking at. And, I shared her hope and optimism that was a really big breakthrough moment, having remembered the despondency at Copenhagen back in 2009. I think this COP will sit probably somewhere between that. The dynamics of what's already playing out with, Xi from China very, very unlikely to be attending, but Bolsonaro from Brazil not being there, Putin not being there. There's a whole, other than Biden and the EU, there's very few people who are going to be there, other than maybe Scott Morrison is a last minute kind of show up, but he's got his own interesting dynamics in Australia going on. I think in terms of sort of looking more positively about best case scenarios, I think that the Paris Agreement is what we've got. It's doing anything internationally in consensus-based situation is incredibly tough, and this is what we've got. So we need to make this 5-year peer review, peer pressure, cyclical ratchet mechanism kind of work. And we're now at this very first moment of trying to demonstrate it. And it's a little bit wobbly, it's a little bit creaky, and it really depends who was in the key leadership roles at certain times. It was when it was Obama with Xi, with China and the US, and that dynamic back in 2014. It was really a bilateral agreement that really got the Paris Agreement over the line. I would argue in the momentum that was created. So it's about momentum. Looking at the UK, just zooming in on our situation here in the UK, I would say that post COP26, I have a slight concern that once the international spotlight of COP26 is off this government, then they could go a little bit wobbly in places with some of the backbencher pressure that we're already seeing building up in the Conservative Party. And we've had remarkable consensus in this country for 20 odd years, really political consensus, in stark contrast to, say, Australia, Canada, the US. And that's a precious thing. And I think there's broad public support as well, routine polling showing that there's concern about climate change and a desire for there to be action. So I think that's what I really want to see out of COP26, that we have it's almost like an Olympics moment back in 2012, a kind of moment where the world's eyes are on the UK. Can we step up and use that momentum both internationally, of course, but also nationally? Can we just keep that going and try and create this race to the top dynamic and try and show genuine global leadership and persuade others to come with us? And we at Carbon Brief, we just last week or so, we produced some analysis showing that the UK is one of the world's largest historic cumulative emitters of carbon dioxide. We have a moral position in this country, as we've been burning fossil fuels and developing our economy for 200 years. And I think we have a moral position to go first and to do that. So I think that's what my hope is coming out of COP26.
Yes, and let's not forget, halfway through the Holocene, about 5,000 years BP, that's when we deforested the country. We should be covered in deciduous woodland, but we cut it all down. So we've got a long history of doing things to the environment. But that's very interesting. So you think there's some hope if COP doesn't quite hit its targets? Nevertheless, we can, with this COP, build a momentum going forward.
Well, just very quickly, I think there's a very, very open question still about what is success? What is the successful outcome at COP? I've been asking that question, and many journalists have been asking that question, putting that to the UK government for months, saying that honestly, what do you want the headlines to be on that day after the COP concludes? And they can't really answer it. You hear these kind of Boris Johnson kind of terms about this is a COP of cash, what's his line, cash, trees, and some, I can't remember, cars, I think it is, which are kind of, it's been focus grouped and all the rest of it to try and get these nice words to try and get people to understand it. But actually some of those things which are important are kind of outside the COP process. They're not actually what's being negotiated. And I think, yeah, it's a very, very interesting time for the UK, both where we are in terms of our history, where we've come out of the EU, where we think we are geopolitically, where our place in the world. It's a fascinating moment for UK, positioning in a way.
Interesting, fantastic. So, Mya-Rose, you raised some really interesting points about marginalised groups and hearing their voices. And I guess with the COVID situation, there is, barriers to getting those people to COP26. And Leo has said that, if the dynamic is not the same doing these things over Zoom. So do you see some risks there for this particular COP of not hearing sufficiently from marginalised voices just because they physically can't be present?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that there's always been issues at COP anyway in terms of hearing marginalised voices. So I think even without the extra issue of, Zoom and technology and the pandemic, I think there would still be a lot of issues around inclusion and diversity, and not just marginalised voices, but honestly countries from the global south that don't have as much political power. So yeah, I do think it's going to be an issue, but I didn't have that much hope anyway, to be honest. But I think that there are lots of ways to counteract this without actually having people at COP itself, which arguably wouldn't be super helpful in the first place. For example, there are lots of protests happening outside COP, which I am quite excited for. There's various other things going on. There's lots of international campaigns with big NGOs, or I don't know, letters being written to local MPs, whatever. There's lots of other stuff happening that's not within COP itself. There's lots of interesting things going on. And so I think even though people aren't necessarily going to have their voices heard at COP itself, I think that there's still lots of potential for them to be heard in different ways, and arguably them being able to influence the wider climate change movement and the way that people talk about and think about issues is more helpful than making a speech at a political event itself. And
Alyssa, can we offer Mya-Rose any comfort about the ability of the COP process to hear from those marginalised groups, or is her reading pretty correct that actually it's difficult if you're a small country or from the global south to get a say in matters?
Well, I mean, she's right. I mean, I don't know that I don't know if I can say anything that completely gives solace in any way. But I think it's a responsibility incumbent on the people who have a seat at the table to also bring those other people to the table. So, I mean, delegations are all different sizes, but within countries, every country has marginalized voices. So making sure that those people are somehow part of those delegations where that's possible, so that they can have access to these discussions, is really important. And that's important not just because it's the right thing to do, but it's important because everybody needs to be part of the solution, and the solutions that we craft have to bring on board the ideas that are relevant to all different people. So if you're not bringing in those diverse voices, you're not going to get as many options and as many good solutions as possible. So I think to some extent, you know, there's rightly so a kind of pressure on people who are doing events, for example, in the Blue Zone, where you've got more access to the negotiators to make sure that they're presenting a diversity of voices there, including more voices from the Global South, where there are kind of pavilions being run by different organizations. So that is an opportunity, and that's something that, you know, people should be continuing to take on board.
We've touched a little bit in our conversations this evening on protest and the effectiveness of protest. And Leo, you said some interesting things about officially sanctioned protests within the negotiating space at COP. So from your experience of previous COPs, did the protests that go on within and outside the official zones, can they influence the process on the fly as it happens, or are they really just tolerated?
The protests that happen outside of the official COP venue, in my experience, have far more impact and have far more moral poignancy, purely because of the numbers. Like when I was in Madrid at the last COP, there were, I can't remember how many, 100,000 people that we witnessed marching through the streets of Madrid, and that's powerful. And even though they might be miles away and behind security fences and all the rest of it, that still dominates media coverage, you know, and, you know, it gets attention for sure. The protests that happen inside the COPs are a little bit stilted, a little bit in a straitjacket. It's controlled. They have to apply for permission. And then they get ejected. All that, you know, their badges will be ripped off and they'll be blacklisted from being in a COP any future if they do anything wrong. So that is a very, very problematic dynamic. And to be honest, the media largely ignore it. It makes a few photo opportunities, but it's really the outside the COP protests that have the drama, create the drama and create the moral poignancy, I think.
Okay, and Maya, so groups like Extinction Rebellion or Insulate Britain, how effective do you think they are at making politicians change their views? It sounds like, I mean, the school strike for climate seemed to have a galvanizing effect, but I guess not every protest movement makes that transition. So what makes an effective one?
I think actually, like with the ability of hindsight, I think that Extinction Rebellion has also played a really important role in a lot of ways, as much or possibly in the UK more than youth strikes for climate. And I think, again, it's going back to this thing of the way that the conversation around climate change was about 5 or 6 years ago. Oh no, it was only 3 years ago that they first popped up, which I guess that shows in and of itself what a big impact they've had. Which I suppose not all protests, not all groups have to be built the same, and they don't all have to do the same thing. And I think the main strength of Extinction Rebellion has been pushing the boundaries in terms of the climate change conversation. So I talked a bit earlier about how climate change was often seen as quite a radical issue. It was seen as very left-wing, it was seen as very niche. And I think one of the great things that Extinction Rebellion has done is take I suppose the point that was seen as radical and move it right over here, which meant that other people were able to take this point, this fairly middling point, and they weren't seen as radical or extreme anymore because there were the extremists over here. Mm-hmm. And I think that has been really important in terms of environmental issues. I think it's why youth strikes for climate are looked on as kindly as they are. Because it's this thing of, you know, a kid could have joined Extinction Rebellion, at least it's not that, you know, I think that they've been really important. And I think that shouldn't be underestimated. And I think in general, protest is really important. I think it's so easy for people to become really frustrated when it's them being impacted by protest. I won't comment on Insulate Britain because I don't know that much about them, to be honest. But I know in terms of Extinction Rebellion protests, people become really upset. And a lot of people don't like the idea of protest, I suppose, that disrupts people's lives, that makes itself heard. But I would argue that if you want people to listen to the protest itself, rather than, I suppose, the wider movement, as with Youth Strikes for Climate, you have to do something disruptive to be heard. And, you know, that's been done well in some cases, been done less well in other cases. But I think that in general, you know, protest plays an incredibly important role to play. in terms of pushing for political change, in terms of the wider movement, and I wouldn't underestimate that.
And Alyssa, just maybe to finish off, is that your sense from when you have conversations with Cabinet Office or senior decision makers in government? Do they think about the optics of things and what protest groups might do or organise, or do they just carry on regardless?
Well, I mean, they do, and I mean, because they're concerned about a few different things. I mean, there's all kinds of different decision makers, and some of them who are really kind of serious about action on this issue want that to work. And you discussed social science before, and there's lots of people, the kind of many silent people who need to be brought with us on this journey. Some of those people are put off by protests, and some of those people are inspired by protest, depending on who they are, and so on. And so that's the consideration of people who are, you know, making policy, what kind of attention these different things will attract. It is something to consider. As I said earlier, the making your voice heard point is really important, because, you know, the kind of voices from kind of the young people collectively, which was not perceived to be extreme, but it was perceived to be widespread and across the board, definitely made politicians think that if they wanted people to vote for them and the next generation to vote for them consistently, this was an issue they had to take seriously. So it made an enormous difference to those people, enormous. And it couldn't be dismissed as just one or other small group of people. It was just impossible to do that. So that is something that matters. Many people working on this issue, including people in the civil service, some of them do protest. So that's also, you know, I'm not saying necessarily in the civil service, there are people who are now kind of in jobs who also might have a personal affinity with these, or not always, but some do. So, you know, that's also something to bear in mind. And I think the other thing I'd say is, as someone who looks at this probably from a bit more of a technical angle, usually, and kind of a policy angle, I really like the fact that some of the protesters have clear asks. That's a nice thing. I think that, you know, this issue matters to me, and here's what I wish you were actually doing about it. Because that actually means that if people are really concerned about the protesters, they could maybe do those things. And also it allows, as I said earlier, a more diverse group of people to be involved in coming up with the solutions. If there are things that people haven't thought about before or haven't thought seriously enough about before, that's really helpful.
Fantastic. And I think that's a really positive note to end on, and to leave our audience with the point that, yes, you can make a difference still. Your actions do count. And by continuing to put pressure on politicians, persuade your friends, relatives, and to advocate and educate about climate change, little actions can make a big difference. I think on that, I would draw the meeting to close. I'd like to thank our panelists this evening, Mya-Rose Craig, Alyssa Gilbert and Leah Hickman. I'd like to thank Amanda Woodman-Hardy, one of the Cabot staffers who's had most to do with putting this together, but also Vicky Jones, Angus Morris, and Adele Hewlin and Sophie Ross-Smith. So all those people in Cabot behind the scenes, thanks for making this such a great event. And thanks to the audience for listening. Thanks very much. Have a good evening. Take care.